Don't be sad. Everything is going to be okay. I know how you feel. Time heals all wounds. You have to look for good in the situation. It was God's will. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. God won't give you more than you can handle. Everything happens for a reason. And my favorite, it is what it is. When someone we know, someone we love is hurting or grieving or lonely, we want to comfort them, right? We want them to feel better. We seem at the same time to be afraid as well that if those we love are hurting, we aren't allowed to feel okay or happy. Or we seem to be afraid that their hurt might somehow rub off if we get too close. So we try to fix and to comfort and to move quickly past the hurt. How often do we try to comfort someone to avoid our own hurts? How often do we try to say something and end up effectively saying nothing, at least nothing actually helpful? And so in our effort to comfort or reassure, we simply offer placating platitudes. You heard my top 10 placating platitudes. I imagine you have some of your own, especially if you've suffered a loss recently or have been on the receiving end of those kinds of placating platitudes. The fact is, we simply have a hard time being present when someone is suffering or hurting. It just stirs up our own fears and brings us face to face with our own vulnerability and mortality. Is it any wonder then that we struggle to experience or accept God's compassion? Is it surprising that we cannot always accept the truth that God is with us when we're suffering because we either don't know how or are afraid to be with others in their suffering? I remember a woman years ago, clearly pre-pandemic, telling me about what it was like to grieve the death of her husband. We got on the subject of placating platitudes and of people simply not knowing what to do to help, and therefore saying and doing things out of their own discomfort. She told me that while she was extremely grateful for everyone's concern, it was kind of exhausting to be a gracious host to all the folks who came by the house to extend their condolences. But, she said, one friend just came over to the house and cleaned the kitchen. Next, she came over and did the laundry. Then she came over and just sat in the next room knitting. This woman told me that her friend's presence was what she really needed. Her friend didn't need to say anything, and it didn't much matter what she did, although there was admittedly a bit of relief in not having to clean the kitchen after all the grieving guests had left. Her presence mattered more than words or particular actions. What a great lesson for all of us. Of course, the beautiful thing about God's presence is, unlike a friend who comes and goes, God never leaves us alone. I like to say that there have certainly been times in my personal life when I have stopped paying attention to God's presence or when I've pushed God away. But God has not, does not, and will not leave me or you. Now, we have all had more than enough hardship, suffering, pain, separation, and loss this past year. We've probably all heard the emptiness in these placating platitudes, and we've perhaps even said them to ourselves at times. We've all longed for the simple, comforting presence of God, especially as we've been separated from others whom we love. Well, we began the holy season of Lent this past Wednesday, smearing ashes on our foreheads to remind us of our vulnerability and our humanity. It certainly felt different this time around, at least for me, given how loudly and forcefully the state of our world has shoved our vulnerability and humanity in our faces. Do we really need Lent this year? Haven't we had enough of remembering that we are dust and of giving things up? We cannot, of course, avoid our humanity and our brokenness. We shouldn't avoid our Lenten practices of self-examination and repentance, of prayer, fasting, and self-denial, and of reading and meditating on God's holy word. But since we've been on an unavoidable and forced journey of fasting and self-denial for nearly a year now, I'm going to assume we've got that part down. What often gets lost in our conversations about Lenten disciplines, though, is how God is with us as we come to face with our humanity through those Lenten practices. You see, we can fall into the trap of mistakenly believing that these Lenten practices serve to appease an angry God who would inflict wrath if we were to ignore our efforts at expiation. We can fall into the trap of mistakenly believing that these Lenten practices serve either to make us morally superior or to place an inordinate focus on our shortcomings. Let's do something a bit different this year. Not to avoid those fruitful Lenten practices, but to approach our Lenten journey from another angle. This Lent, I will invite us each week to take up, to reflect on, to ruminate over, to luxuriate in a simple but profound verse from the psalm appointed for that Sunday. The Psalms indeed give expression to every possible facet of human experience. While we may sometimes make them sound like platitudes, they are anything but. The Psalms give space for us to feel, to emote, to weep, to seethe, to rejoice, all in the presence of God who created us and who loves us. And as we relish a sweet and beautiful facet of God's presence in our lives, we can allow the psalm to elicit gratitude to God, because the simple practice of expressing gratitude to God in word and action offers the most reliable and immediate pathway of transformation and transportation to a place of peace in the presence of God. This week's verse is Psalm 25, verse 6. It's actually the refrain in the sung version of the psalm today. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and love, for they are from everlasting. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and love, for they are from everlasting. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and love, for they are from everlasting. And as we recite that verse, we must also pray, help us, O Lord, to remember, to know, to experience deep within us your compassion and love, for they are from everlasting, and they are my deepest need right here and now. While it may be true that no other human being could fully understand our particular pain or loss or grief, God certainly does. God's compassion, God's capacity to be present in our suffering is boundless and eternal. In other words, the psalm says God's compassion isn't a learned skill or a rare gift. It's a basic and essential part of God's nature that transcends our created order. No matter how profound our hurt, our loss, our sadness, our loneliness, I promise God can and does reach through the fog of loss and the wall of pain to be with us. I hope we can remember that while suffering might be inevitable, and we have all experienced plenty in this pandemic time, we can know and experience the strong, loving presence of God. God will never, never leave us alone. And for God's everlasting, unending compassion and love with our whole heart and body, soul and mind, we give thanks.